This is the Dark Pictures Switchback, a new VR game coming exclusively to the PlayStation VR 2. However, for us PSVR veterans, we will forever know this simply as Rush of Blood 2. For those not familiar with the previous PSVR 1 entry, Until Dawn Rush of Blood, Switchback is the spiritual successor to that title, and is a combination rollercoaster ride, haunted house experience, and arcade shooter, rolled into one big VR Turducken, or haunted coaster shooter if you will. Rush of Blood is still, to this day for me, one of my favorite VR titles to throw friends and family into. Does Switchback fill that void on the PSVR 2, or even improve on the first? Stick around, the answer may surprise you. Hey guys, it's Chris from the VR Grid, and once again, I must apologize for my voice as I am still getting over my sickness. That being said, welcome to the channel. If you like this video, give it a like, and if you're interested in more VR content from us, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss new videos as they drop. And if you're looking to join our VR conversations, feel free to leave a comment, or even better, join us each and every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific here for the Virtual Boys podcast. So yeah, like I said in the beginning of the video, Rush of Blood on the PSVR 1 was and still is a very special title for me. I remember when Sony first showed off footage of the title as one of the early launch titles of the PSVR, and thinking to myself how lame it was that with all the potential of VR, one of Sony's exclusives would be a simple rail shooter with cheap jump scares. Yeah, it was those things, but it was also a brilliantly balanced title that managed to be a thrill ride and a competent arcade shooter, with just enough horror sprinkled in to be creepy and fun without being too scary to the masses. Add into that AAA visuals and a high level of polish, and Rush of Blood was easily my biggest surprise in the early days of the PSVR 1. And here we are again with the follow-up Switchback, a title I absolutely was stoked about when it was announced, as a sequel was on my short list of PSVR sequels that I needed in my life. So it pains me to tell you that while not a bad game by any means, Switchback for me is a disappointment. Starting things off, I want to talk visuals as they are right in front of you, and I don't want to talk around the elephant in the room. Right from the main menu screen, I was surprised to see a lot of jagged edges, which is never a good sign. Jumping into the first level, and I was recalibrating my IPD and eye tracking as I for sure thought something must be amiss here, and that's because Switchback as a whole is just not a sharp title in the headset. This did not look like the PSVR 2 title I was expecting. I mean, even the guns didn't seem to be clear in the headset. Playing further, and I was taken aback by the level of low quality textures and jagged edges throughout. Making matters worse, the game is at times rife with texture pop-in, especially noticeable when outside and looking at the forested areas. These issues combine with a general lack of polish to the whole game, and I'm starting to wonder if this had been originally designed for the PSVR 1, was shelved, and then only rushed to completion for the PSVR 2 release. At least, that would explain the visuals on hand here. This feeling of the game being rushed out by the door is further reinforced by the often uneven quality of the level design that is at both times helped and hurt by Switchback's levels being based around previous entries in the Dark Pictures anthology of choose-your-own-adventure styled cinematic games. Helped in that Switchback does offer up a sense of variety in its settings beyond that of Rush of Blood, as it jumps between various inspired settings of previous games. But at the same time, it is hindered by the fact that some of these previous titles in the franchise just don't seem to lend themselves to the gameplay of Rush of Blood, whether that be aesthetically or thematically. As such, some levels simply feel like patched together stages using the assets and enemy character models of previous titles, and it couldn't help shake the feeling that some of these enemy stages or parts of them simply felt shoehorned in to work, or simply phoned in by the developers, a point that is further reinforced by some stages seeming to pad their length by reusing certain areas and assets. However, when the game nails an area, and it does indeed at times, it can be a fantastic display of horror thrill ride design. It's just unfortunate that this isn't the norm. Lighting effects here are top notch though, and feature some great use of dynamic flashlights as they cast real-time shadows off the environment, creating some truly creepy shadow work that is sure to pucker up many a buttholes. Furthering this, the game plays much more with lighting, using it to great effect to keep things exciting and unpredictable, often taking your light sources away from you entirely and drenching you in a darkness that is really driven home by the true blacks of the PSVR 2 OLED display, and yet blinding at times when lighting up the darkness with the explosion of your muzzle flashes. Additionally, Switchback does much more with particle effects here, really leveraging such things as fog to create a sense of atmosphere that was simply not possible back on the first PSVR. Now, it's not all bad, and yes, this game is still better looking than the vast majority of VR titles these days, but the bar here was set pretty high by the first title. I could forgive some of the bland level design, but ultimately, the lower resolution of the title and sheer lack of polish in some visual areas just makes me want to wait for a patch to make this actually look like a PSVR 2 game. Finally, those wondering about Mura and reprojection issues, Mura is present, though not aggressively so here, and honestly, something we at the channel will probably stop mentioning in games unless it's out of the ordinary. Reprojection, though, is certainly noticeable, especially when looking to the side and looking for it. It's never too distracting for me, but it was present. Getting into the gameplay side of things, this sense of Switchback being developed for the PS4 hardware is further driven home by the game's irritatingly long load times upon death, something we really shouldn't be seeing on a console with a solid-state hard drive. That aside, loading into the beginning of the game, and I guess I was expecting something similar to the epic opening of Rush of Blood, as you rolled into the opening credits, blood pouring down your face as you came face to face with the very charismatic ringleader host of a character, welcoming you to the upcoming ride. Well, that didn't happen here. Instead, I was greeted with a rather dull opening scene sitting on a passenger train with a bunch of other people with no idea why I was there. Then loaded up right into the starting train car for a very bare bones and rather boring tutorial. There was no AAA vibe here, no excitement, and before I knew it, I was starting the first stage. Looking back, this should have been a warning sign that Supermassive Games just didn't seem to be treating this entry as the passion project that the first felt to be. The developers didn't seem excited for me to play this, but I was determined to. And I did. Sorta. First things first, yes, this is very much the follow-up to Rush of Blood. You're in a roller coaster car cruising through haunted house type areas, all while shooting enemies bent to kill you. The ingredients are all here. However, while it's hard for me to put my finger on it, the recipe just isn't as perfected as the first title. To better understand this, let's break things down a bit first. Looking at the roller coaster portion of the game, much remains the same here as the game alternates between slow and fast sections. However, I would say as a whole the roller coaster portion is more subdued here than in the first, which frankly was exactly the opposite of what I wanted, hoping that for a sequel they might dare to be a little more extreme in sections for those of us, with built up VR legs over the last 7 years. Instead, we see a lot of slower sections slowly moving through portions of uneventful track. Maybe this was done to give players some time to relax between shootouts or push kind of the atmosphere of the game, but to me it often felt like padding to extend the track runs, and it hurt the tight and finely crafted tracks found in the first game. Further to this, absent are some of the more extreme drops and track jumping sections from the first. Instead, Switchback trades these up for sections where it comes to a full stop. I'm guessing in an effort to build suspense and push the horror side of things, but it does this at the expense of keeping things moving and exciting. Now, all this being said, the game does still have its fast sections, and you will still be bobbing and weaving to avoid overhead obstacles, but it is used here to a lesser effect than the first. Now, speaking of the haunted house and horror side of the game, I'm curious to see what many of you think down in the comments, as games don't really scare me in VR. As such, it's hard for me to gauge the scare factor here. Supermassive Games is obviously trying to make Switchback a scarier experience than Rush of Blood, with more of a focus on jump scares and enemies that like to get right up in your face or even directly on it. Playing much more with lighting and fog effects, it also loves to take away your guns from you, which means you also lose your flashlights, leaving you feeling very vulnerable in a way the first game rarely did. Adding to this, the game's sound design is first rate here in the way it plays with the horror music stylings and 3D audio of monsters creeping, running, crackling, and slurping away in the darkness or around each corner. Unfortunately though, from a creepiness side of things, Switchback all too often felt like it was doing a paint-by-numbers homage to what was done in Rush of Blood, ticking all the boxes, but rarely being able to bring it together like the first game did. That being said, the game does have its moments, like the Westworld-themed hotel of animatronic dummies and the soon-to-be famous blinking sections of the game where enemies only move when you blink. And when the game nails these parts, it is masterclass VR game creation. Unfortunately, the tracks are often, like I said, padded and simply go on too long with not enough happening. Now, without any real knowledge of the previous Dark Pictures games, short of one, the levels simply felt like theme rides to games I've never played. Consequently, Switchback has no real story itself, and outside of being able to piece together that I'm trying to save the nameless people sitting in the train car in the game's opening moments, there's really no connective narrative between sections of the game. Offering up a total of 11 tracks and the opening intro level excluded, each anthology game gets 2 connected levels each. Building on the ability to change track directions that we saw in the first Rush of Blood, Switchback takes its namesake very seriously here, offering many more choices to switch tracks, and consequently, adding a lot more potential replay value to the game over Rush of Blood. Tracks take about 20 minutes or so to complete, and each track has its own scoreboard. However, at the completion of the second level and a mini-boss beaten, players are given an overview of choices made at each track junction and what they did or didn't do as a result. In an effort to be much more in line with the hallmarks of the anthology series, Switchback attempts to give you a sense of your choices actually mattering. Doesn't really work here, but for those who care, the point seems to be able to make the right choices in order to save a character from that specific anthology series. So like I said, the point of the game seems to be to save all the people on the train car from the beginning of the game. Personally, I didn't really care about this, but I did appreciate what they were trying to do here in what is essentially just an arcade shooter. And yes, one thing Switchback does do different here over Rush of Blood is introduce new, albeit not game-changing ideas as you play through its levels. Some stages might require you to use an infrared light to highlight hit points in order to open blocked track in order to get away from a pursuing enemy, while other parts might have you use a flare gun in order to burn blocked areas or solve some basic symbol puzzles. These ideas do help to freshen up the gunplay here a bit, but it's used too infrequently to have much of an impact. Gunplay here remains much the same as Rush of Blood though, with your primary loadout consisting of 2 revolvers, each reloading by shaking your hands, though this can be set to auto reload in the settings, and many of you may want to turn this on, for I found the reload mechanic here to be a bit hit or miss, as the game seems to have made it a bit less sensitive than the last, likely to reduce unwanted reloads. Similar to Rush of Blood, gun upgrades can be picked up throughout the level by shooting boxes, offering up a limited ammo upgrade in the form of another single-handed weapon. Though I would say upgrades here are less often and simply don't seem to be as rewarding as they used to be in Rush of Blood. I also must say that as a sequel, I think Supermassive missed a huge opportunity here to have built into the sequel some sort of weapon and ability upgrade tree, one that could have been developed through completion of the game and then further playthroughs to open up new weapons and sections of the game. For as it is, the gunplay is pretty much the same here, though with a significant drop in the creativity of enemy placement, combat style, and really any combat situations that the first had. Playing the first, I distinctly remember trying to take on the chainsaw enemies or snipe out hidden enemies by shooting out exploding barrels. None of that is here in Switchback, and is instead replaced by a repetitive use of enemies jumping in your face or simply coming at you in waves from left to right. Ultimately, like other parts of the game, it all feels very paint by numbers, like the team just wanted it out the door, rather than creating something truly special like the first game. Further to this, sadly, the carnival shooting gallery feeling that Rush of Blood built into even the slower section of Rush of Blood is very poorly implemented here, feeling like a complete afterthought, coming off more like make work to keep players busy than actually a meaningful part of the game. One new aspect here in Switchback that is straight up awesome though, is the implementation of haptics in both the DualSense controllers and the headset. Hit your head on a 2x4 and you're gonna know it. As for the controllers, haptic trigger effects give some weight to the gun triggers, while the HD rumble is expertly used here, from everything to popping off shots, to the simple sensation of rolling the gun around in your hands, or the clanking of a train car going up the steep incline. It's awesome stuff and something that I think all developers need to put time into with the PSVR 2. However, I must mention that speaking of controllers, tracking here in Switchback, while very decent, isn't without its flaws at launch. And I did run into a few times where a hand would lose tracking and all of a sudden pop into view. I could never replicate it on purpose though, so it seems like it might be more of a glitch than simply poor tracking. And speaking of glitches, yes, I did have the game freeze up on me a few times, so there's that. And that brings me to my final thoughts and review score. Rush of Blood was a PSVR 1 classic through and through, and I had high expectations for the follow-up in Switchback. Unfortunately, Switchback all too often feels like a movie sequel made by a studio without the same writer and director. It might have the same actors and sets, but it lacks the soul, craftsmanship, and magic of the first film. Switchback isn't without its moments though, and I still had fun, as the combination rollercoaster, haunted house, and shooter is, come on, it's hard not to like. But the game just isn't as fun as Rush of Blood. It lacks that game's polish and passion, and it suffers greatly on the visual side of things, often feeling like a PSVR 1 game ported to the PSVR 2. Hopefully, a future patch can improve the game's resolution, bringing it into line with the expectations of 2023, but ultimately the gameplay here just too often feels like a chore than a thrill. The VR Grid gives Dark Pictures Switchback a 6.5 out of 10. Guys, unless you're just dying for this, it is not worth the day one price. I would instead wait for a sale, or at least wait for a big visual patch if it comes. Thanks for stopping by, guys, and as always, I will catch you on my next video.